Color. I love color. I think most of us love bright, beautiful colors. To a great degree, that's why we're artists. We look around us and see all this beautiful color all around us, and we just want to paint it. So then why is there so much conflict and confusion and argument among artists about color? Whether a color is warm or cool. How do we sort this all out? Did you know that there are some experts who will say, supposed experts, I don't know if they're experts or not really, but they'll say that ultramarine blue is a cool blue and phthalo is a warm blue. And then there are others that say that they're experts that will say that ultramarine blue is a warm blue and phthalo is a cool blue. Which one's right? How do we figure this out? Oh, I don't know. Don't look at me. Wait a minute. You think that just because you bought my course that I should tell you which one is which? All right. You know what? I'm going to tell you exactly what I think about the warm and cool of ultramarine and these other colors, and let you know what maybe you should think about it as well. So, let's see what we can discover about color, shall we?
There are so many different color wheels, books, courses, theories, and opinions about color and light. It's one of the most difficult areas of painting to sort through and decipher. Look around you right now. Unless you're spelunking without a helmet light or scuba diving deep enough to compress a submarine into a tin can. If you are, why on earth are you watching this video? We are surrounded with light and color. We experience both of them every day of our lives. From the moment we wake up to the time we close our eyes, we're affected by them. How can it be so complicated for us as painters to figure out color? And why is there so much disagreement among artists? Much of the complication and confusion come because we're dealing with two distinct types of color: additive, or light, and subtractive, pigment. If we add all the light waves or colors of light together, we get white. When we mix the major pigment colors together, we get a dark pigment. We subtract light or white from it. So when we read or hear artists discussing color and things start to contradict, it's often because they're either combining and confusing light color and pigment color, or they're describing their own feelings about color, which are entirely subjective, yet seem very distinct and accurate to that particular artist. So when we artists get caught up in worrying about the science and theory behind color, we can become so bogged down that we lose the freshness and the joy that make our painting special in the first place. I encourage all of us to study and learn all that we can about color, especially how one color affects another and how those in turn affect the viewer. Accurate knowledge is powerful stuff. Much more important to us as painters, though, than studying about color and worrying about what is written and theorized about color, is experimenting and playing with color on our canvas. And by color, I mean pigment. No theory about color comes close to practical application. Actually mixing the pigments on our palettes with each other and learning what they do and don't do. I know they don't sound very appealing, but creating color charts with our chosen pigments will do so much more for us than any book about color on the market today. Now, I do use a large selection of paints on my palette, and that might get overwhelming for some, or expensive. I'm more inclined to start beginning painters off with the full palette of colors, but if you really feel you need a more condensed palette, I would suggest titanium white, lemon yellow, cad red light, quinacridone red, ultramarine blue, and phthalo blue and phthalo green, with maybe the transparent oxide red and oxide yellow thrown in, if you can afford it. You can probably mix all the colors you'll need from that list. Just for fun, let's look at a few of the different opinions and tools that swirl around the topics of light, color, and pigments. Learning the temperature of the colors in nature and the light we're painting under is complicated enough, but many artists want to add more drama to their lives by arguing about the temperature of their pigments. Our home, we talk about being a no-drama home. I think artists need to adopt some of that idea. Sharon Hicks wrote a blog post about which is cooler, ultramarine or phthalo blue. She began the post with statements such as, "A lifelong journey of exploring color theory. exhausted every book on the subject. This is based on science according to measurable differences. She took the color wheel and turned it into a linear spectrum, stating unequivocally that the warmest hue, red, was at one end, and the coolest hue, lavender, was at the other. So scientifically, ultramarine is cooler than phthalo, because ultramarine is closer on the linear spectrum to violet than phthalo is, so that settles it. Then you see all the comments from artists who are so concerned about this subject. Really? All that over which is recognized by the art community as warmer? Who cares? I would bet that most of those so worried about it are weekend or occasional painters, because professional artists are way too busy painting and learning how the colors work in practice, not in theory. Although, it seems Dan Nelson agrees with her according to his suggested palette. By the way, I would not encourage Naphthol Scarlet, simply because I like to stick to colors that are rated 1 for light fastness, and it has a rating of 2. Not terrible, but when there are excellent alternatives with a 1 rating, why mess with it? So is Sharon Hicks wrong about yellow being the warmest and lavender being the coolest? Well, it depends. And that's how it goes with art. There are two main schools of thought. It depends on whether we are one of the group who tend to follow the chroma of a color. So in my case, I like to think of red, whether red has been added to a color or not. So red being added to ultramarine blue makes ultramarine blue a warmer color. But that's because I'm focusing on the chroma of colors. Well, at least to an extent, I focus on all of it. That's what gets complicated about this. I'm not just using often one variable when I'm out thinking about these things. I'm thinking of a lot of different factors as far as the illumination, the brightness, the chroma, so many things. I also tend to think in terms of my pigments on whether they have red or not in them, and is that red making them, in my opinion, warmer. But there's another school of thought that thinks in terms of the brightness or the illumination. So they're thinking of yellow being warmer because it's brighter, because it's, to them, it comes towards them more fully because of that brightness. And in that case, then, if yellow is, in their opinion, the warmest color, then lavender would be the coolest color. Thinking in the terms of warm and cool this way doesn't really address all of the possible issues that we might have when we're out on location. That's why, even though it sounds almost like a cop-out, it really is critical that we think in terms of what am I seeing in front of me, and what are the pigments on my palette going to do to help me to duplicate that, or create that, or paint the illusion that I'm trying to paint in front of me. So this is not an indictment against Sharon Hicks in any way. We all go through this, trying to figure some of this out. I'm simply trying to help each of us to spend less time worrying about some of the semantics of all this, and more time playing with our pigments. So let me give you a simple example of what I mean by all of this by describing how I paint a sky, or what I'm thinking about when I see basically a daylight, sunny sky. If you paint the sky at its farthest away point becomes cooler, lighter, and greenish blue in tone. Although, interestingly, there is a band of reddish hue where the horizon and the sky meet. As we look up at the sky, right above us, it becomes darker and warmer. How do we paint a sunny sky? We use a cooler blue like phthalo, manganese, or cerulean for the major mass, and add some ultramarine or cobalt to the top, or that portion that is less distance from us, to warm and deepen the sky. Now, when we've finished painting our big, beautiful sunny sky, if we're still bored and curious, we can then move on to all the other color experts. Betty Edwards' course, Mastering the Art of Mixing Color, Color Theory Made Easy by Jim Ames, Blue and Yellow Don't Make Green by Michael Wilcox, and on and on. There's the Munsell color wheel, the Yermby wheel, Stephen Quiller's wheel, tools to isolate exactly what color is out there in front of us. My recommendation is to ignore all of them, since they mostly contradict and confuse, especially the possibly well-meaning, yet in many respects, unsound color experts. Although Quiller's wheel is nice to the extent that he does list similar hues together, which is helpful if you want to find an alternative to a pigment you're dissatisfied with. I have a crazy idea. Instead of reading all this stuff from these color experts, why don't we do some painting instead? Let's cover some of the ideas and experiences I've found useful painting from life, and especially outdoors. The primary colors we've been taught all our lives are way too general for painting purposes. Which red, blue, or yellow we use, and what exact hues we mix to get the specific value, chroma, and color temperature we want are much better ways to think about color. Forget about primaries, secondaries, and tertiaries, except where the idea might slightly guide us to find the correct complement or balancing hue to enliven, tone down, gray out, darken, lighten, saturate, or in some useful way alter our colors so they work in our painting and capture what we hope to paint. There are too many variables at play with pigments to apply such a simplified system. Some pigments look similar but mix very differently from each other. One pigment is more granular or fine than another, and behaves uniquely when mixed with other pigments. Some pigments are so staining that they might overwhelm our mixtures, while another pigment of similar hue is barely noticeable in comparison, like the difference between phthalo green and viridian. Some colors are transparent, some opaque, and that affects how they react, especially in the beginning stages of a painting. Selected colors like alizarin crimson become desaturated or dirty looking when mixed with white, compared with pigments like quinacridone red, which remain bright and clean. Yet both are considered a decent complement to viridian or phthalo green. Then we have the various tints of white, from titanium, which cools other pigments significantly, to the warmer lead white. Color wheels and systems, which might be nice to get acquainted with, are wholly inadequate to paint by. And that goes for any system designed to eliminate muddy color, create harmony in a painting, or show us how to mix the perfect color every time. Just ignore them until we have plenty of extra time on our hands and we want to quell some irresistible curiosity about them. For now, let's spend our time mixing paint on our color charts and on our palettes, and have fun creating magical illusions to dazzle and uplift the viewer. Learning our pigments is essential so we can recreate not only what we see in nature, but also what we mix and place on our paintings. For example, in this hollyhock piece, I began by brushing in the sky because I wanted a more vigorous or energetic look. I used a lot of brush texture in the mountains for the same reason. I also wanted to create the illusion of distant plane shifts and cuts in the mountains. As I developed the composition further, I decided to change those mountains to a bank of trees so I could push some of those trees off the top of the painting to create a counter to the tall hollyhocks on the right. As I added more detail, I realized that the tall trees in the background detracted from the rising hollyhocks. They became competition rather than a complementary mimic of them. So I changed them back to hills. This is where it's essential to learn our colors. We never want to just get lucky with a color. Wow, I really like that color. I have no idea how I got it, but I sure like it. We need to learn how to recreate any color we see or place on our palette or painting. As you squint and think about what you're about to paint, compare each area or color to the areas around it and ask yourself 3 questions. What is the value of this color compared to the others? What is the hue? And what is the relative chroma or purity of that hue in comparison to those around it? Always start with value because that's much more critical than hue. As a helpful guideline, to make colors more vibrant, keep the values so most are in the middle range with a few spots reserved for the darkest dark and lightest highlights. This is because the strongest saturation of color is found in the halftones between light and dark. In birdsong, I wanted strong saturation of the colors, so I reserved the bright highlights and deepest darks to just a few areas to help lead the eye around the painting. Many artists, especially in the plein air movement, like to compress their values into the first, second, or third 3 or 4 steps of the 9 or 10 value scale. If that sounded confusing, look at this image of a 10 value step scale with white being number 1 and black being number 10. Some artists like to use a range of values that only uses values 2 through 5, or the values 3 through 7, or maybe 5 through 8. That's a compressed value range. I'm not a fan of this tendency because I like contrast. And compressing the value scale means they're eliminating the outside dark and light values to keep within a limited key. By key, I mean the relative brightness. Sticking to the first 4 steps of a value scale is a high key painting, and using the last 4 steps is a low key painting. So instead of a deep, rich number 8 or 9 dark in the shadows and a bright 1 or 2 in the highlights, they compress everything into only 4 or 5 steps on the value scale. We often see this with beginning students who do it unintentionally because of a lack of confidence or courage. Strong contrast often draws attention to mistakes or weaknesses within the painting. So beginning artists get in the habit of compressing their values. While the idea of compressing values might make life easier for those artists, I think their paintings lack drama and energy. Whenever I see a value compressed painting, I have to stop myself from saying something like, you know, if you just put a nice dark shadow right there, it would really sparkle. Yeah, that would go over well. Besides that, that's simply what I like, not what everyone else might like. Obviously, in this course, I'm going to emphasize greater contrast and richer color because that's what I love to see in paint. Making mud. There's really no such thing as muddy color. No matter what color we mix, that color will probably work beautifully and look amazing in the right painting. Maybe just not this one. So why not in this one? More than likely, it's the color temperature that we misjudged, not the hue. That's why learning to discern the temperature of our light source is fundamental to getting the correct color mixed on our palette. The light source affects all the colors we see. Outside in warm light, you can expect the lights to be warm and the shadows cool. If the light is cool, you can expect the lights to be cool and the shadows warm, most of the time. If we're struggling to figure out if our light source is cool or warm, we can just take one of our white panels and place it on the ground with something on it to cast a shadow. If the shadow's warmer, our light source is cool, and vice versa. I like what James Gurney said about muddy color, as illustrated by these pictures done by Richard Robinson. More paintings suffer from the fruit salad disease of too much pure color rather than from murky mud. The cure for either problem is good value organization. In other words, good planning before the final colors are mixed. And I would add to that, good observation of what colors we actually see in our subject. Knowing that it's the color or temperature of our light source which determines the colors we see, it's also possible that in north light or a cooler overcast day, bright-looking yellows, oranges, and some reds will become slightly desaturated by the blue light. Or in other words, the chroma will not be as strong. Using colors straight out of the tube like cad lemon or cad red light in a painting where all the other pigment colors have been modified or desaturated to match the light would probably not work. It would be like that Sesame Street skit. One of these things is not like the other. Okay, so I'm not a singer. Anyway, since the light source is on the blue side, we wouldn't see the same desaturation or lowering of the chroma of most blues and greens and violets. Just think of it as though you were adding a blue hue to each of your colors. Which ones would be affected most, and in what way? Notice I said probably or possibly during that explanation. That's because there are exceptions, especially since our eyes and brain compensate for the color of the light and can adapt the colors to match our personal understanding. The colors may appear more saturated even if they aren't. This idea of desaturation is something to pay attention to as a guide, not a rule. When we describe colors or pigments as warm or cool, it is essential to remember that hue temperature is warm or cool relevant to what is around it. Most thoughts on temperature result from our feelings about color based on our personal experiences and cultural habits of thought. For purposes of practical painting, when we see a pigment in isolation, the temperature of that color is ambiguous. Is alizarin crimson cool or hot? Well, compared to cad red light, it's cool. Compared to cerulean blue, it's hot. Why is alizarin crimson cool compared to cad red? That's the important question. Primarily because it has blue in it, which cools the redness. So when we're choosing a palette of colors and we say to grab a cool and a warm version of a hue, we mean relative to each other, not to all the other colors on the palette. The idea that cool colors recede and warm colors advance is too general as well. Hills get bluer as they go off into the distance because yellow light waves are the first to be filtered out by the atmosphere, and blue light waves remain indefinitely to our view. But in painting from life, there are times that a warm color will push away and a cool one will advance. The important thing is to learn how to see the color correctly and place that in the painting. Arbitrarily changing the temperature of a hue that we see just because we've been told that it couldn't possibly fit according to the warm-cool concept can end up throwing off other color relationships until we suddenly wonder why our painting isn't working, such as in shadows. Generally, we want shadows to recede or push into the background so the object creating the shadow comes forward past the shadow. That's one of the reasons we try to keep the paint thinner in the shadows as well. Texture tends to draw attention, and that extra detail can pull an area forward. Although George Carlson has quite a bit of texture in his shadows, and it doesn't seem to bother him a bit. At the same time, we don't want our shadows to become dark pits of nothingness, or as Princess Bride would say, the pit of despair. We definitely want the shadows to have some visual interest and beauty to them. To sum up, in pushing a shadow back, causing it to recede, if we went strictly by the warm advances, cool recedes principle, we would want all our shadows to be cool. Something I've observed, however, is that the color of shadows is distinctly influenced by the temperature of the light source, and often contains the complement of the color of the light source in both warm and cool varieties, depending on both the temperature of the light source and the bouncing around of reflected and refracted lights. For instance, a tree's cool shadow in a field of green grass on a hot sunny day may be bluish-green overall, but where the shadow touches the base of the tree, it will often be very warm and a deeper dark. And there will also be spots of warmth inserting themselves throughout the shadow. Also, a shadow within a cool shadow will usually be warm. Mixing transparent red oxide into warm shadows on a cool, overcast day works so well because the red-orange in the oxide complements the blues from the cool light source. That doesn't mean we use those colors exclusively. I change up my shadows according to the degree of warmth or coolness of my light source, such as adding sap green instead of oxide red, or using less oxide red or less ultramarine blue in one shadow and more of it in another shadow. It depends entirely on how I feel about what I'm seeing and how it looks in relation to everything around it when I actually place it on my panel. Sometimes I warm up my shadow more than it might look to me just because I like it, like increasing the red on the shadow side of a tree limb to give it gusto and to balance the surrounding green and yellow leaves. If my color feels off, I modify it, but not until I have enough other colors established to know for sure. Another way to play warm and cool pigments against each other is to place individual strokes of broken color next to one another, such as the bits of blue and lavender interspersed through the warm yellow and orange leaves and grasses. The cool colors help the forest vibrate and create the feeling of movement and energy, like a gentle breeze causing the aspen leaves to quake. Using a warm and cool hue of basically the same value, we can take an otherwise boring flat color plane and make it vibrate and shimmer and really engage the viewer like Dan Myduk did in This Evening Sky. If I was given the chance to own a painting by any artist, Myduk would be in my top 5. His use of color is phenomenal. Look at the way he places pink and green complements next to each other. If he had mixed them together and blended them, they would have created a dulled down hue. But placed beside each other, they make the sky become electric without calling too much attention away from the center of interest, the Indians. Notice in this painting how effectively he breaks up patches of underlying colors with definite strokes of warm and cool hues, and how he used warmer and cooler colors placed next to each other in the shadows of the horses. The cool turquoise colors definitely advance, while the warmer violets recede. And in this sunlit piece, he uses a warmer dark in the center of the horse's shadow and the cooler blues on the outside edges. A fun thing to do occasionally is to paint a scene using mostly a cooler family of colors to create a somber or lonely feeling with just a spark of warmth to keep the viewer engaged, like much of Jeremy Lipking's work. Or reverse that using primarily warm color mixtures with some cool complementary shadow colors like I did in Rocky Mountain Dream. There's so much going on in nature that often a well-blended color falls short of describing the extraordinary complexity of what we experience. Painting with such seeming color abandon as Marduk does takes courage and a sound knowledge of our pigments, but it's certainly worth the effort. If it takes 10 years of constant work to learn it, is that too much to ask? We'll most likely have a lot of fun along the way, and just think of the possibilities when we actually master it. According to Harvard neurobiology professor Margaret Livingstone, the rods in our eyes perceive value, and the cones receive color information. Then, two separate areas of the brain interpret these signals. A complication comes into play when we discover that the rods are sensitive to blue-green light waves, and in fading light, see those colors as lighter than they are. So when we're painting at dusk in deep shade or creating a moonlit scene, it'll help to understand that the seemingly glowing green leaves are probably not that light. A quick aside, I was walking from the studio to the house last night and glanced up at the moon. It's yellow, not blue light that emanates from it. The reason everything looks so bluish in hue under moonlight is because we simply can't distinguish colors at night. We need light to see color, and the small percentage of the sun's light that reflects off the moon for us to see by is not sufficient to see anything but some overall value patterns. That applies to detail as well. Details disappear, and we're left primarily with larger masses, except whereas street light or light from a window illuminates a small area. We essentially need to use our imagination a bit if we want to paint convincing night scenes. The same goes for sunset and sunrise scenes. The color range is dramatically diminished by the lack of light. I haven't done many night scenes. The drama is appealing, but my love of bright saturated color generally trumps the drama of night scenes. Although Matthew Cornell and Marduk's work shows how careful observation and imagination can really spice things up. And I will need to create a part 2 for this subject as well. Burning the wee hours of the morning light again, I'm afraid. Have a great time painting.